Welcome everyone. My name is Ahmed. I am Palestinian from Gaza, and I would like to welcome you today to this exciting conversation with Dr. Azzam Tamimi. The title of today's webinar is called Colonization and Resistance, Palestine and the Struggle for Unity, Sovereignty and Liberation. This national webinar is hosted by Palestine Justice Movement Sydney and Free Palestine Melbourne, and endorsed by many organizations across this continent. Before I start introducing our guest, Dr. Azzam, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on traditional land. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today or dialing in from today, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This land was never ceded, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. This land is a ground zero of a genocide that occurred more than 230 years ago, and its echoes still reverberate to our day. I am dialing in from Camaragal country. Again, I'd like to welcome everyone who's joining us today, including those who are joining us from the dark side, I should say, as in, the brainwashed Zionists and their mouthpieces from the media. Welcome. For those, I should say that all opinions expressed by me today represent my own personal views as a Palestinian from Gaza who happened to live on this colony and who happened to have his family enduring the current 15 months barbaric Zionist genocidal campaign. And anything I say should not be construed or misconstrued as me using my authority or agency, or the authority and agency bestowed on me as part of my workplace. Again, I am delighted to be in conversation with Dr. Azzam Tamimi. Dr. Azzam is a British Palestinian academic and political activist, the chairman and editor-in-chief of Alhiwar dialogue TV channel. Dr. Azzam has written several books on the Middle Eastern and Islamic politics. Middle East, I would call it Western Asia, including books like Islam and Secularism in the Middle East, Hamas, A History from Within, and Hamas, Unwritten Chapters. We have a great pleasure today, truly, of speaking to Dr. Azzam Tamimi, since not only he's an academic subject matter expert on Hamas movement, that is the Palestinian Islamic resistance movement, but also because at certain points in time, he had also close connections with its leadership. Dr. Azzam, welcome to the conversation, and thank you so much for joining me today, all the way from Turkey.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure is all ours. So, Dr. Azzam, there is a long anticipated temporary ceasefire in Gaza after an unimaginable genocidal campaign against the Palestinian citizens of Gaza. I actually can't believe that I finally get to say that, it's been a very long, horrendous 15 months, to say the least. We can all agree and hope that this halt will hold and become permanent at some point after 15 months of such a brutal Israeli campaign that explicitly, and that is by the admission of many human rights international organizations, explicitly targeted civilian populations and civilian infrastructures in Gaza. The level of inhumanity and barbarity that the Israeli regime has shown and is still showing during this campaign has been unspeakable. But during these 15 months of genocide, a lot had happened within the region as well. Israel has been accused of the crime of crimes, the genocide, by the highest legal establishment in the world, the International Court of Justice. Israeli prime minister and his former foreign minister have arrest warrants against them issued by the International Criminal Court, many UN resolutions and legal communications issued against the state of Israel, demanding it to dismantle the system of occupation, oppression in the Palestinian territories and bring an end to the apartheid regime. Israel is becoming more and more of a pariah state. We saw an acceleration of the BDS movement, boycott, divestments, and sanctions. Some say the date, October the 7th, has created one of the most critical junctures, if not the most critical juncture, in the history of the Palestinian struggle for sovereignty, justice, and freedom. Namely when the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, made the unilateral decision to embark on Operation Al-Aqsa flood on October the 7th, 2023, that breached the then 16-year-old siege on Gaza, trying to change the status quo there and reposition the Palestinian cause back on the international political agenda. And I've been to Gaza. I lived in Gaza. I know I was in Gaza a few weeks before the genocide started, and I know what that status quo means for the Palestinians there. But amongst the challenging products of this genocide was the deepening schism between the main Palestinian political parties, namely Hamas and Fatah. Fatah being, the main dominant party of the Palestinian Authority. So I don't want to have this question dominate the conversation, because I know there's a lot to talk about. The potential ceasefire, the contribution of the American administration, the situation in Syria, they're all connected. But I do want to start with asking you this question, Dr. Azzam. How did the Palestinians get to this state of disunity and fragmentation in the face of the Israeli system of oppression and occupation? What are the main factors that perpetuated this division? But before you start answering this question, just to set us up for this conversation, could you give us a quick historical review of the main Palestinian political players, including Fatah, the PLO, the relation between the two, and the evolution of the PA out of the two structures following the Oslo Accord, and more importantly, where does Hamas stand from those structures? I mean, what is the political context, the political forces within which Hamas was first created? I mean, these are a lot of questions, I know. It's a loaded, complex question, but I believe in relativity, as in behavior of things may be best explained in relation to external elements and conditions. So could you help us unpack those questions?
Well, again, thank you very much for hosting me. And let me just begin with a slight correction. I did not write two books on Hamas. It's just one book, but with two different titles. The British edition is titled Hamas Unwritten Chapters. The American edition of the same book is titled Hamas, A History from Within. And it's just been published in Arabic. Actually, it was released 2 days ago in Beirut under the title Hamas Fasulun Lam Tuktab. And the book has already been translated into several other languages, including Turkish and Malaysian, etc. Now, the struggle for liberation always sees division among the indigenous population. That's natural. It's not really unique to the Palestinian situation, because there are always those who get tired or get exhausted and fed up and cannot continue the struggle and become prey to some promises and therefore decide to settle for something instead of everything, or settle for a little of what they have been struggling for. We saw this in South Africa before. We saw this in Algeria. We saw it in Vietnam. That's the human nature. And actually, the original Palestinian liberation movement that came into existence after a meeting of its founders in 1957 in Kuwait was the Fatah movement. And most of the founding members of the movement were originally members of the Muslim Brotherhood. They disagreed with their mother organization because the mother organization, the leadership of the mother organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, came out of the 1948 experience with bitterness because rather than being rewarded for the sacrifices they made to prevent the Zionist project from unfolding inside Palestine, they were actually severely punished by the governments of the day, especially in Egypt. So the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood post-1948 in Palestine, I'm talking here about the Palestinian chapter, came to the conclusion that Palestine cannot easily be liberated or simply be liberated through the struggle of the Palestinians on their own. This is a huge project. This is a global project. It's a colonial project that needs preparations at various levels and needs the involvement of the Arabs and the Muslims. And therefore, the priority was for reviving the Ummah, for rebuilding the Ummah in order to stand up and defend the Ummah and defeat the Zionist project. Now, these revolutionary members of the Brotherhood who were not happy with this discourse came out, and together with Yasser Arafat, whom they came to know through the student years in Cairo, he was for some time the leader of the Palestinian Student Union, formed Fatah. And now Fatah continued to be an idea until 1965, until the 1st of January 1965, which is considered to be the day of the launch of their resistance. What is interesting is that a year earlier, in 1964, the Arab League formed the PLO. So the PLO wasn't really a Palestinian creation. It was an Arab League creation. And the Arab League originally was a British creation. Now, the idea was to tell the Palestinians, okay, if you want to liberate your homeland, here we have created an organization for you, go ahead and do it. And that was a reduction of the Palestinian issue, initially from being an Islamic issue to becoming an Arab issue, then finally a Palestinian issue. And the founders of Fatah were very conscious of the threat that posed to the cause, to the extent that they considered the creation of the PLO a stab in the back, a conspiracy against the cause. I mean, imagine. But of course, 4 years later, Fatah took over the PLO, and the leadership of Fatah became the leadership of the PLO. Now, what happened in Fatah is that they adapted to the Arab situation and became integrated into the Arab official system and accepted the limits imposed on the Palestinians by the Arab system. Of course, we don't have time to go through this in fine details, but eventually what happened is that after Egypt entered into a peace deal with Israel in the aftermath of the 1973 war, the PLO leadership, represented by Yasser Arafat, were convinced that the train of peace was passing through, and they had one choice: to ride in that train or be left out. And that led in 1974 to the 10-point declaration. And the 10-point declaration is the first signal from the PLO leadership that they were willing to recognize Israel's right to exist in exchange for a Palestinian state. And that led to the emergence of the idea of a two-state solution. Now, Hamas was not the first Islamic movement to join the resistance. It was preceded by Islamic Jihad. And Islamic Jihad itself, the founders of Islamic Jihad, were also former members of the Muslim Brotherhood who, for different reasons that primarily had to do with the eruption of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, decided that they could not continue to be part of the Brotherhood. So they left and formed Islamic Jihad. The founding of Hamas came in completely different circumstances. It coincided with the eruption of the Intifada in 1987, when the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood branch of Palestine decided that it was about time, having come under enormous pressure from their own younger members, to transform themselves into a resistance movement. And on the 9th of December 1987, the Muslim Brotherhood of Palestine became the Islamic Resistance Movement, the acronym of which in Arabic is Hamas. So this is a very brief.
Very brief indeed, yes.
And you see, I have a problem with people who find this division within in the Palestinian community to be problematic. Why should it be problematic? Actually, there has to be a division simply because people have different visions. If you have a group of people whose vision is that Palestine cannot be liberated, and we need to accept that Israel was created to remain, and that the solution is to settle for a Palestinian state anywhere, at least to begin with. And then on the other hand, you have a group that considers Zionism to be unacceptable, intolerable, and unrecognizable, and that Palestine sooner or later will one day be free. These are two contrasting visions. How can they unite? How can they come together? And that's why since 2005, and I followed this quite thoroughly, and I sum up this in my book as well. Since 2005, dozens of meetings were held between Hamas and Fatah in Cairo, in Doha, in Istanbul, and elsewhere to reconcile the two groups. Eventually, it was Israel that made the final decision that you cannot reconcile with Hamas until Hamas recognizes Israel. So Fatah ended up actually demanding a recognition of Israel from Hamas. So you see, how can you reconcile? How can you be united with the people who have this vision? My mother would not have accepted it. My father would not have accepted it. My grandparents would not have accepted it. Today, I don't accept it. My children don't accept it. My grandchildren don't accept it. No sane Palestinian who knows the history of his people or her people will accept recognizing the legitimacy of aggression on Palestine and the Palestinians.
And that's mainly what people mean by free Palestine. You know, basically it's the Zionist rhetoric, it's the Zionist ideology that is in nature is a settler colonial ideology that seeks to weaponize religion to achieve political gains and imperialist gains in the region. And so I think so what I understand, Dr. Azzam, is the main difference and the main reason of fragmentation is actually the different understanding of how sovereignty looks like for the two parties. Is that a right characterization?
Well, partly, yes, you can put it this way, but it is really about being defeated. Yasser Arafat was defeated. His Fatah movement was defeated. They couldn't. I mean, look at the contrast today. The people of Gaza have been hammered constantly for the past 15 months. The number of people killed. Actually, today there was a study released that says that Israel, or not a study, I think this was probably, let me remember, Newsweek in an editorial said today or this week that Israel is responsible for the largest number of civilian deaths in the world during 2024. Despite this, the people of Gaza have not surrendered. You haven't seen a white flag calling on the Israelis to have mercy on the people of Gaza. The people of Gaza knew that despite the pain, despite the suffering, despite the starvation, despite the genocide exacted upon them, that they could not accept Israeli colonialism. It's a vision. It's a vision. It's how you see the problem. Those who have reduced the problem with Zionism to a territorial problem, they fall into the trap, or they fell into the trap. This is not a territorial issue. It's not a dispute over who gets what. This is an invasion. They came from Europe. It's a colonial project. And it's nothing to do with Judaism. It's nothing to do with religion initially. Actually, it's a great book by John Rose by the title, The Myths of Zionism, in which he explains that the founding fathers of the Zionist movement and Israel were all atheist and secular, yet they employed religious discourse in order to justify their crimes against humanity, their crimes against the Palestinians. We and the Jews and the Christians in that part of the world that is known as the Middle East today have lived for centuries in peace and tranquility. No problem whatsoever. Well, probably minor problems of the type that that is considered insignificant. And the Jews remained in Muslim lands, in Iraq, in Morocco, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Libya, in North Africa, in the whole of North Africa, in Turkey. These areas functioned as safe havens for the Jews who were persecuted by the Christian Europeans elsewhere in the world. And I would strongly recommend the autobiography of my dear friend Avi Shleim by the title 3 Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew, in which he explains how the Jews of Iraq were expelled from Iraq, not by the Arabs, not by the Muslims, but by the Zionists who were dying, who were desperate to have more Jews come and migrate to Palestine. So you see, if you don't have this vision, if you don't know the history, or if you don't care about the history, probably they know the history, but they don't give a damn about it. People like Mahmoud Abbas, who actually did his PhD in Russia on Zionism, he doesn't now give a damn about what he discovered in his PhD and what he learned from the about the history of the Zionist movement. These people have lost it. These people are defeated. They agreed to become tools of Zionism. Today, the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah is acting as a security organ, aiding the settlers and the Zionists who occupy Palestine, killing the Palestinians who are trying to defend their own families against the encroachment, the daily encroachment, the daily abuses of the settlers who are occupying Palestinian land. So once you identify the difference in vision, that's it. That's why I've always been, I've had arguments constantly with my friends in Hamas, because I was always opposed to these useless talks of reconciliation with Fatah. And now time has proven me right. I'm sad to say, because these guys have accepted, have agreed to become part of the Zionist machine. They are no longer part of the Palestinian liberation project.
Absolutely. And we saw that manifesting in Gaza when Hamas won the election in 2006, which led to that, bloody infight. And we see that in Jenin as well, Jenin refugee camps. It's absolutely shameful how committed the PA to the Zionist rhetoric, as like you mentioned, as being a tool for the colonization and the occupation and apartheid. And unity efforts has been going on for as long as Hamas was in power, to my understanding, and they were the ones who always sought unity, but they were always opposed by Mahmoud Abbas or Netanyahu, rejecting all offers. But I do want to go back to, I want to talk about the ceasefire, the potential ceasefire, hopefully. But I also want to veer back to the start. I want to talk about, how did October the 7th operation and the genocide that ensued in Gaza impact this division, this fragmentation between the West Bank and Gaza? Because this is the dream of the Zionist regime, really, to keep the two Bantustans, if you will, separated politically, geographically, and so on and so forth. How did Operation October the 7th entrench that division? I mean, we're hearing a lot of talks at the moment about the popularity of Hamas in Gaza and the West Bank is not actually shaping well. I mean, there is a poll by the Palestine Center of Policy and Survey Research, PSR, which is an independent non-for-profit institution working from the West Bank, and they usually release different polls. They released different polls over the past 12 months, and the recent one, all the polls they showed kind of gradual decline in the popularity of Hamas in Gaza, but to my surprise, the popularity of Hamas in the West Bank is not actually declining, and we kind of see the reason. So I don't want to get out of this question, but how did October the 7th narrative now shaping up during the genocide in the Palestinian community? How do we talk about what happened in October the 7th after the ceasefire?
Well, I'm not sure about the 7th of October having had a further impact on the division. I think the division is there anyway. I'm not also sure about how accurate polling can be in circumstances like the one endured by the people of Gaza, when people are homeless, starving, being massacred. I just really don't know how you can conduct a poll and claim that it is accurate, but it doesn't matter. Polls can be useful, of course, definitely. They give you certain measure of things, but for me, what really matters is the idea. The general public may have different sentiments in different circumstances, and that should not in any way influence the principle. The principle is that if your country is invaded, you defend your country, even if you are in a minority. It doesn't matter. Numbers don't matter here. Majority, minority, it doesn't matter. What matters is the truth. If you are a victim, you are a victim, even if the majority of the people in a certain place on the face of earth don't consider you to be a victim. We, the Palestinians, how did the West generally consider us until the 7th of October? Generally, people thought we, the Palestinians, were the aggressors, as if we were victimizing the Jews somehow. Only after the 7th of October that an increasing number of people started going to libraries, to bookshops, digging in the archives to see what's behind this conflict that doesn't seem to come to an end. And then they discovered that it was the Palestinians who are the victims in this. And that's why the 7th of October, what really matters to me is not the impact of the 7th of October on how popular Hamas is or not, but rather on how the conflict is seen by the world as a whole. And that's the most important accomplishment of the 7th of October.
Absolutely. It's actually put Palestine back on the social agenda for the West and for the global North, as it were. And I also agree with those polls not being very overly accurate, because we're hearing in the news, in the Israeli news, actually, that how Hamas has managed to recover its political enterprise, its social enterprise in terms of recruitment as fighters in Gaza. So all that should matter for some sort of statistics as well. But I want to go back to the ceasefire announcement. I want to ask this annoying question. I mean, if Biden and Harris continued to be in the White House and they were elected for another term, would we have seen such an agreement made? I mean, would we have seen an end to the genocide? I mean, what can we expect from Trump's administration moving forward when it comes to Palestine as well?
Well, it is true that Trump is claiming credit for the ceasefire agreement. And it is true that this is also the perception in many quarters. But I think a number of factors came together to make this possible, including the role played by Trump, because Trump said to Netanyahu very easily, I want the war to end before I enter the White House. Apparently, Trump has promised Netanyahu the green light to annex the West Bank, or at least parts of the West Bank. And this is the argument Netanyahu used to convince the members of his coalition. Probably had the Democrats been retained, we might have had a little bit longer killing in Gaza. But eventually it was going to come to this, simply because Netanyahu was not achieving his objectives. I think that's the crux of the matter. That's a major issue here. He set out to achieve two goals: free the hostages and destroy Hamas. He neither freed the hostages nor destroyed Hamas. And it's become very clear that Hamas, despite all the losses incurred, had the ability to regenerate, to revive itself. And it was on a revival course. So probably we might have had a few more weeks, a few more months, but eventually Netanyahu was going to meet this fate because of the growing dissent within Israel itself, and because of the pressure from various quarters around the world, and above all, the steadfastness and the resilience of the Palestinians themselves.
Absolutely. I always say it's not just Trump, it's not just Qatar, it's not just those people. I mean, most of the work that was done on the ground in Gaza, fending off the invasion of Gaza and the sieging and the ethnic cleansing, and also, a lot of credit should be given to those negotiators on the Palestinian side, being steadfast and resilient in the face of, this Israeli belligerence during the negotiation. I do want to encourage everyone to start putting the questions in the Q&A, because we're going to start taking some of those questions. But before we start, I've got one or two questions. I'll do one question. What is the Palestinian resistance exit strategy out of this ongoing genocide? I mean, hopefully we'll get into a temporary ceasefire soon, which will become, fingers crossed, the permanent one. I mean, what's awaiting Gaza in general? I mean, what do you think is the vision of the Palestinian resistance collective for the future?
I think the people who believe in their right to resist occupation believe that they can have phases in that struggle. This is, again, is not unique to the Palestinians. This is something that other peoples experienced in their struggle for freedom and liberation. Many people on the 7th of October, 2023, not many, a few, I should say, but later on it became many, but a few individuals on the 7th of October itself started digging from the Vietnamese experience to compare the 7th of October of what happened in February 1968 in Vietnam in what is known as the Tet Offensive. And frankly, I myself didn't know about it until I read it on the 7th of October. So I went searching, because in 1968, I was 13 years old. I still remember watching footage of the Vietnam War on our black and white TV screen, but of course didn't follow thoroughly, didn't understand. I was still a child, but I was amazed at the contrast, at the similarities, at some aspects of similarity between what happened in Vietnam and what happened in Gaza or in Palestine on the 7th of October. Similarly, like the 7th of October, like Al-Aqsa flood or Tufan al-Aqsa, which experts considered to be a failed military onslaught, the Tet Offensive was also considered by the experts at the time a failed military onslaught, but it led to a huge and historic political victory, a turning point in the history of the struggle of the Vietnamese people against American imperialism. And this bore fruits in a number of years. It took about 6 years after the Tet Offensive for Vietnam to become free from from the yoke of American colonialism. So if you believe you have the right to resist, and if you don't give up just because you are made to suffer, if you believe in a cause, of course you will have to be prepared to suffer and to make sacrifices. If you are that kind of person, then it doesn't matter even if you don't see the fruits with your own eyes, because you're working for future generations to see those fruits become ripe. My grandfather struggled against British colonialism. My father struggled against Zionist colonialism in 1948. My own generation, the generation of my children, the generation of my grandchildren, the struggle will continue until there comes a generation that will enter into the land and liberate it from this colonial invasion. And you can have a sense of this when you see the people of Gaza and other peoples around the Arab world, probably around the globe, expressing delight at the current results. Yes, we've had 45,000 to 50,000 people killed in Gaza. That is true. We have had hundreds of thousands of people who have been maimed or made homeless. Utter destruction everywhere. Yet people with their natural instinct, instinctively recognize the current ceasefire as a victory for the Palestinians, because the Palestinians have not enabled Netanyahu to achieve any of his declared objectives. And because nobody hoisted a white flag, and because nobody has given up. And I think this is what matters.
I agree with you. I think it should be viewed, no matter how much painful the losses, the sacrifices that we've witnessed over the past 15 months. I think the steadfastness and the resistance of the Palestinians in Gaza have achieved this victory, I would say. But when you talk about eventually a future generation, or maybe this generation, will liberate Palestine. So what do you mean by liberation in that case? I mean, we've heard a lot of sentiments saying, settlers have to leave, all these people in Israel, they have no places here. Like, what is our vision for liberation as Palestinians?
Liberation means an end to the Zionist regime. The Zionist regime that believes to have been given divine license to usurp Palestinian land and kill the Palestinians. Now, once this regime comes to an end, then peace will prevail. And this does not stipulate that anybody needs to leave the land. There's plenty of space for everybody, provided that this apartheid regime, this racist regime is no more. We can return to living together like we used to live in history. Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, Christians, Jews, living together as equally dignified human beings. See, what happened in Palestine is not just the occupation of land, it's the installation of a system, of a regime that considers or that claims that being a Jew means you are superhuman, that you have divine rights above everybody else. That is unacceptable. And this is a repeat of the South African regime. And I think we can learn a lot from the South African experience. When the apartheid regime leaders went to see Nelson Mandela in his Robben Island cell, they said to him, come on, Nelson, we want to put an end to this. How do we end this conflict? And he said to them, very easy, no more apartheid, and then we can live together. And this is exactly the sort of vision that Sheikh Ahmad Yassin had. Sheikh Ahmad Yassin very explicitly said, we are not against the Jews. This is not about a conflict between religions or the followers of religions. This is about colonialism. So if you end Zionism, which is the ideology behind this colonial project, then we can talk about the details. There's no problem at all.
Absolutely, I agree with you. It's this supremacist ideology that is dominating the Israeli society. And to your point, there's plenty of space to fit everyone. We're going to be hosting Dr. Salman Abu Sitta next month. We're going to be talking about the right of return. I mean, all what the Palestinians demanding is meeting international UN resolutions, 194, 242, and all these things to live together. 242 calls for, the end of occupation, the dismantlement of apartheid, other resolutions. So all what we're calling for is, meeting Israel to meet its obligation under international law with all the different UN resolutions. And that will eventually result in the fall of this racist apartheid regime. And that's what free Palestine means.
Well,
that's what liberation means.
UN resolutions don't do this. We have to be careful here. UN resolutions were issued to maintain the status quo created by the establishment of Israel in 1948. I am against Zionism in its entirety. The UN resolutions don't reject the Zionist entity or the Zionist regime. They just want to create a peaceful situation in which the two peoples can coexist somehow, probably in two neighboring entities. That's nonsense. My mother was born in Beersheba. She grew up in Beersheba until the age of 16, when her family was forced to leave and come to Al Khalil, to Hebron, my father's hometown, during the Nakba. You think my mother would have agreed that Beersheba remain an exclusively Jewish city, part of an exclusively Zionist state? We have to undo the injustice. And that's what freedom for me means. Once we undo the injustice, we undo the apartheid, just like happened in South Africa, then we can tell everybody, okay, we can now live together. But I wouldn't accept that the victors in the Second World War, who created the United Nations and who were behind those resolutions, dictate for me and for my children how to live in our ancestral homeland. Probably you can settle for a UN Council resolution if you are hopeless, if you are desperate, if you are defeated, if you are giving up on your rights and the rights of your ancestors and your forthcoming generations. That's not my philosophy. That's not my opinion.
Couldn't agree more. And we can project that into the present. I mean, people from northern Gaza, if there was a resolution saying they have to live for the entirety of their life in the southern Gaza and never return to northern Gaza, I would definitely feel the same. So I couldn't agree more. It's a one state, it's a shared state. It's like you said, it's going back before the idea of Zionism was injected into this region. I can talk for hours about this topic, but I do want to open it up to the Q&A. There's a question here that talks about the leadership, the Palestinian leadership beyond the current genocide. I mean, what would the Palestinian, I mean, how will the Palestinian govern themselves? Is there, who could be a potential leader to lead the way, to lead the Palestinian movement into a liberated Palestine moving forward?
Well, that's a matter for for the Palestinians to decide. As the Palestinians gave rise to previous or current leaders, they will do the same in the future. Once again, I want to stress here is that what matters really is the vision, the clarity of vision. If we know what we want, then we will generate the leaders that will struggle in order to accomplish that hope and that aspiration.
There is another question here that says, in light of the judgment back in July by ICJ finding the occupation illegal, should this be the focus of movement in Australia now? It called for a change. Countries like Australia treat Israel economically, diplomatically, and culturally. And can you talk about ruling and explain what the court consider occupied territories, 67 borders, or Oslo? Is it time to accept mini-state as a step to future liberation?
No, it is time to recognize Zionism for what it is. What we need is to trigger a global anti-Zionism movement, the same as the global anti-apartheid movement in South Africa in the 70s and the 80s that led in the early 90s to the collapse of the apartheid regime. The same thing. You see, whether the Palestinians have a mini state or a big state, so long as there is a Zionist state next door, that Zionist state, because of the supremacist ideology, because of its racism, because it is the another side of the Nazi coin, there will never be peace in the region. You can have peace in the region if you treat all humans as equally dignified creatures of their Lord. That's what we need to aspire to achieve. And I think the principal struggle for the people who sympathize with the Palestinians around the world is to impose sanctions on Zionism and the Zionist entity, to engage with BDS, to be active in that boycott process, and also to be active in enlightening the general public about the truth, about the reality of Zionism, its history, its ideology, and what it's doing to the world. I mean, look at what Israel is doing, not just inside Palestine, around the world. They're involved in crimes against humanity in so many places. Look what happened when Assad fell in Syria. They immediately started bombarding left and right inside Syria. They occupied a large piece of land and then eventually withdrew also in Syria. Look how much havoc they continue to create inside Lebanon. Look at the attacks on Yemen. Look at the coalition the Zionists have with Arab corrupt despots who are persecuting their people, who are imprisoning tens of thousands of political prisoners, torturing them and letting them rot inside jails. There is an alliance between Zionism and the corrupt Arab regimes. And the result, of course, is more suffering, more tribulation for the general public. Zionism is an evil. This is the message that we need to send to the people around the world.
Absolutely. It's addressing the root cause of the problem, the initial root cause. And, Israel always goes about saying, Iran is the head of the snake. I would say Zionism is the head of the snake, is the root cause of all the oppression that is, wreaking havoc on the whole region. I wanna go to that question, which is really, really important in the West. Do you think there has been a purposeful demonization of Arabs and or Muslims in order to suppress empathy and understanding towards the Palestinian struggle, or is there specifically an anti-Palestinian sentiment in there? I mean, we're hearing in terms of, demonization, Islamophobia, and so on and so forth, we're hearing, that narrative. They zoom in on certain words in the West, those Zionist mouthpieces, calling, when Palestinians call their victims of this genocide as martyrs, for example. So this wording trying to reflect a negative, twist on it. So do you think there's purposeful demonization of Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, or in the West?
Well, this has always been in existence. I remember as a young man, I was 18, 19 years old when I first went to the UK to study, where I did my A-levels and did my BSc. And I remember on television and among folks, Arabs were not really that highly respected because of the portrayal in the media. Not only because of the portrayal in the media, but also because of the behavior, because of the conduct of some of the Arabs, especially the rulers. I remember that some of the rulers of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries in the 70s and the 80s who used to come to the UK and how they squandered money and left and right and sort of association with what actually Islam forbids. Most of the sins that Islam forbid, they associate with because of their money. So the image of the Arab, the image of the Muslim has always been tarnished by a variety of factors. And I think the Zionist lobby uses this. The Zionist lobby exploits it because in order to defend Israel and justify its crimes, they turn to the people and say, oh, look at the Arabs. This is the Arabs. This is the Palestinian. This is that. And this is so. Though they go to bed with some Arabs. They don't mind. The corrupt Arabs, they go to bed with them. But I think there are moments in modern history where the image of an Arab suddenly improved. And I remember in 2011, as a result of the Arab Spring, the image of the Arab was a brilliant one in many circles in the West. So when the Arabs improve their conditions, when they do better, then their image improves. And I think since the 7th of October, the Zionist lobby is finding it increasingly more difficult to tarnish the image of the Arabs and the Muslims, because people look around and say, look at the people of Gaza. Look at the model they are setting. Look at the example they are setting of sacrifice, of determination, of steadfastness, of resilience, etc. So yes, so much money is being spent on the distortion of the image of the Arabs, the Muslims, and the Palestinians. But I think there are also bright moments, nevertheless.
Absolutely. So this is a good segue for the next question about the Zionist lobby in the US. There's a question there that says, it seems to be clear that Zionism will not fall until the US stops endorsing them. Will this happen?
Well, it is true that the United States of America is the main backbone of Zionism today. It wasn't like this in the past, but it is today. And the reason for this primarily is not really Jewish influence, as some people think. It is actually the Christian Zionist lobby. Christian Zionism in the United States of America is a major power. And although they are anti-Semites, as a matter of principle, actually, they hate the Jews. And that's why they want to send them to Palestine, so that when the Messiah comes, they're given the choice either to become Christian or be killed. So you cannot be more anti-Semitic than this. Yet, the Christian Zionist lobby plays a major role in guaranteeing the support that Israel receives from the United States of America. Now, it is very likely this will change. We've seen recently, I mean, since the 7th of October, we've seen a marked change among the new generation of Jewish young men and women. This is important. Perhaps the day will come when we will see similar changes within the ranks of the younger generation of Christians in America. So I wouldn't rule out anything. It really all depends on how the Palestinians, the Arabs, and the Muslims, and the supporters of Palestine fare. If we do our job, if we send the right messages to the world, eventually these are human beings. They will be receptive and they will be affected by the truth if the truth manages to arrive at their doorsteps.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I mean, educational campaigns are really, really potent in, raising awareness about the nature of Zionism, the origins, the anti-Semitism that actually created Zionism in the first place, and how, Zionism actually feeds off of anti-Semitism as it goes. Like you mentioned, the Christian Zionism is an anti-Semitic movement right from the beginning. But I can't help but noticing this question here. What is the role of the Abraham Accords in normalizing Zionism, or in combating our work here in the diaspora in educating the public about Zionism, while Trump is for example, if he continues to proceed with normalizing relations between our countries and Israel?
Well, indeed, the Abraham Accords is an umbrella for normalizing relations with Zionism. And the idea behind it is that if you get more Arab governments to join in, then that will provide Israel with better security and better engagement. It becomes part of the region, a more natural part of the region. But that's just a myth. It's a mirage, because no matter how many governments join the Abraham's Accord, the peoples of the region overwhelmingly reject this notion, don't accept it. I mean, look, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, Egypt, Jordan, these are the overtly normalizing countries with Israel. And there are several that covertly normalize. Saudi Arabia was about to join in on the eve of the 7th of October, but the 7th of October disrupted their plans. Yet, the peoples ruled by these regimes, from the Atlantic to the Gulf, overwhelmingly reject Zionism and consider it to be an aggression and a threat. So it won't work. And if only people like Trump would listen. Don't waste your time and money on something like this. It won't work. You cannot normalize what is abnormal. You cannot turn into natural what is unnatural. You cannot make legitimate what is illegitimate. So don't waste your time and money on it.
Absolutely. I mean, the evidence to that is those despots have been installed by, imperialist powers, and they are installed against the will of the nations, and the nations themselves do reject this kind of normalization. And so I think all these efforts will be opposed, and this is how we see all these non-state groups evolving in the region. We have, Hezbollah, we have Hamas, because there is a huge disenchantment in the Arab population in their own countries for not being able to express themselves freely and democratically. So there's a good question here about, action to end apartheid. So the question goes, a difference between Vietnam, South Africa, and Palestine is that unions mobilized the Western working class to disrupt capitalism and force the US empire to leave Vietnam and the white supremacists to collapse in South Africa. Can you explain how unions in England and Europe, for example, refused to do this for Palestine in the past 12 or 15 months for fear of being called anti-Semitic, or, cut the funding, sometimes for economic reasons? So can you talk to this point?
Well, there are differences and there are similarities, of course, but I think eventually people will change. There was a time, I remember, as a student in the 70s, when most governments in the West supported apartheid in South Africa. Until the Tet Offensive started in Vietnam in February 1968, most Western countries supported American imperialism in Vietnam. Much of the American public were oblivious to what the government was doing in Vietnam until that offensive started. It was an eye-opener. So you see, people go through stages. Those who refuse to defend the truth today might change their position in the near future or in the distant future, depending on circumstances. What matters really is what we do. I mean, if I and you and the people who are joining us today and listening to us, if they support justice in Palestine, they need to ask themselves, what is it that we need to do more in order to effect change around the world? Whether you are active in the media, in the social media or the traditional media, whether you are in economics, in politics, in whatever field you are in education, which is a very important sector, we need to plan to change the world around us, because the world changes. It doesn't remain constant. It's not always the same. There was a day when Nelson Mandela was considered to be a terrorist. Margaret Thatcher famously said, or infamously said, that he is a terrorist who would never be allowed to set foot on British soil. And then when he was elected president, when his people became victorious and he was elected president in 1994, he arrived in the UK and elsewhere in the world, celebrated as a champion of freedom and justice and human dignity. So things can change. We need just to be patient and never give up.
Absolutely, it's a marathon. And then we have all these instruments like BDS. We could also create an educational awareness campaign around BDS, as we call, for boycotting Israel and imposing sanctions. I wanna go back to Palestine, and I want to talk about the current situation in Jenin. There's a question here: how can we achieve unity with the aggression of the Palestinian National Authority for the resistance in Jenin refugee camps and in Jenin in general?
I don't think we can achieve unity. There will always be dissent. There will always be a group that doesn't see eye to eye with you. Well, if you don't see eye to eye with me on the details, no problem. We can sort that out. Humans don't always agree on every single issue, but on the principles. We're talking here about the principles, about the vision. What we need to do, I mean, the role is to remind people of what this conflict is about, so that those whose efforts are aimed at prolonging occupation, prolonging the suffering of the Palestinians, are perceived as part of the entity of the enemy, not the friends. The Palestinian Authority in Ramallah is part of the Zionist project. It's not Palestinian. It's Zionist, because that's what they do. Unless people see them as such, there will always be this confusion. Oh, why are the Palestinians divided? Why are they killing each other? Why are they doing this? Why don't they do that? Try and understand where this all comes from. It comes from Oslo. Oslo is the agreement that turned the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, into an organ of occupation. That's what happened.
Absolutely. They should change the name to ZLO rather than the PLO now, or the PA to ZA, the Zionist Authority. Couldn't agree more. I mean, if they don't agree on the principles of, combating the main issues, Zionism, occupation, and colonization, which the PA doesn't agree with, then I think it's going to be difficult for unity. I do want to have a question about the UN. I mean, will the UN be able to resist Israel's attempt to destroy UNRWA and redefine who is a Palestinian refugee with the right to return and who is not? And, UNRWA's funding is in danger. UNRWA is being cut off from operating in the Palestinian territories by Israel. How do you approach that question?
Well, the UN can only do what the Americans allow them to do, not the Israelis. The Americans, who host the United Nations in New York, have the final say. The UN is a useless organization, really, in terms of serving justice in the world, because it was created by the victors in the Second World War to make sure, to guarantee that those victors remain to be hegemonic, remain in charge of world affairs. And that's why they have this Security Council with a veto system. So really, unless there is a will on the part of these powers that control the United Nations, don't expect much out of it.
Talking about the United Nations, there's a question here. What is your opinion on campaigning to unseat Israel from United Nations, given there are mechanisms to circumvent the US veto?
I'm not an expert in this regard, but if there is a mechanism to do this, why not? This is part of the struggle. We need to isolate Israel in every international forum. Every international forum, Israel needs to be excluded and isolated. So if that can be done in the United Nations, why not?
Thanks for that. I want to go and talk about the situation in Syria and how that reflects on the Palestinian struggle for liberation. We've seen what happened. There's a couple of questions there. I just want to merge them together and just talk about the consequences of the fall of the Assad's regime in Syria. I mean, we're hearing a lot of commentary now about the situation in the West and locally, and talking about this new group that is the rebels that are forming the government in Syria. Syria used to be part of the axis of resistance, as it were, and now it's been taken out of that axis of resistance, which was of a tremendous support to the Palestinian struggle. So how does the situation in Syria, I mean, what's your vision of the future of Syria firstly? And then how do you see what happened in Syria impacting what's happening in Gaza and in Palestine into the future? And I mean, did what happened in Syria was caused by Al-Aqsa flood, eventually, indirectly or directly?
Well, I think the change in Syria was influenced by a number of factors that coincided at a certain point in time. Definitely the blows suffered by Hezbollah contributed to that, because Hezbollah played a pivotal role in sustaining the Assad regime in Syria. Iran and what it suffered as well had a role in this. The preoccupation of the Russians in the Ukraine is also a factor. But at the same time, the creation early on of a Syrian entity in Idlib was another major factor, because this was like hijrah, migration to a safe haven, where you build yourself and are able to prepare for the next step. You can add to this the Turkish problem with the Kurds, because Turkey had an interest in a change happening in Syria, especially after Assad rejected Turkish requests for talks, for reconciliation, for resolving the Kurdish problem. So all these factors really come together. But as a matter of principle, I would ask people to judge a government not on the basis of its support for any cause anywhere in the world before they judge it on the basis of how it treats its own people. The Assad regime was one of the most brutal regimes in the world. The Assad regime committed crimes against humanity to suppress the Syrian revolution, which was a spontaneous, peaceful revolution for several months before it was lured into militarization. So you see, when people think of Syria as being part of the resistance axis, they tend to feel sorry that the regime is gone. I'm not sorry at all that the regime is gone. I'm very happy for the Syrian people who have begun the march toward freedom after more than 60 years of oppression by this minority regime. Now, so far, I would say so good. The current rulers of Syria, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, seem to be conscious of the responsibilities they have in this transitional period. Their political discourse generally is quite good. Their PR is quite good as well. And we can only pray and hope that the Syrian people will be able to rebuild their society and their country, inshallah, as soon as possible. It is my firm opinion that a dictatorship cannot be good news for Palestine, especially when it is a corrupt dictatorship that, like the Assad family dictatorship. So the fact that the Assad regime is gone is good news for Palestine on the long term. I don't deny that the Assad regime at various stages did provide the Palestinians, and Hamas in particular, with assistance, and even hosted Hamas until the Syrian revolution erupted in 2011, when Hamas chose voluntarily to leave because it refused to side by the regime against the people. And of course, later on, there was some division within the movement regarding how to deal with the situation. Nevertheless, it is my firm belief that Palestine will only be free when the peoples around it are free. The Arab peoples need to be free from the shackles of despotism, need to rid themselves of these corrupt regimes that are blackmailing them, embezzling them, that are robbing them of their livelihood. And Syria is the beginning. I hope to see this repeated elsewhere in the region.
Couldn't agree more. Absolutely. I mean, the way to liberation is through liberating the entirety of, the Arab countries, especially because you mentioned Ummah at the beginning. I mean, Arabs belong to one contiguous region, really, and this is how they thrive throughout the history and heritage. And drawing these Sykes-Picot borders in between them, it only contributed to just destroying that connection. But I don't think it succeeded in completely destroying the connection. We can see, you know, the marches, the demonstrations everywhere in the world, mostly the Arab populations coming out, not so much in dictatorships. But I totally agree with you. I mean, there should be freedom in the surrounding countries as well. I do want to go back to the idea of Zionism. There's a couple of questions there I just want to merge. So the majority, Howard Morosi is saying the majority of the Jewish religion may not have supported Zionism in 1948 or before that, might add. Are you aware that this has changed and that now the majority of the Jewish people indoctrinated as Zionists? Also, the majority of the Jews since the 19th century, the 20th century, has been traditional or secular, and probably a majority has been either Zionist or neutral. So I'm not sure if that's a question or not, but there's another question saying, can you define Zionism again for everyone who hasn't been educated about the terminology before again?
Well, when we talk about Zionism, we usually talk about what is known as political Zionism, which is the ideology that justifies the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And this justification, although it was invented by secular atheists, founding fathers of Zionism, relies heavily on biblical claims. And I would recommend in this regard several books. One of them I mentioned earlier by John Rose, The Myths of Zionism. There's a brilliant book by Michael Pryor called The Bible and Colonialism, and it shows how throughout the history of colonialism, the Bible was used to justify these crimes committed by the colonial authorities. And the author cites three main examples after the introduction. He talks about three examples: the conquista of Latin America, the South African apartheid, and the Zionist entity in Palestine. There's also another brilliant book by Israel Shahak called Jewish Fundamentalism in Israel. And I agree with the statement made by the earlier friend that, yes, the Jews were not always of the same opinion. And this is what Israel Shahak explains in his brilliant book, that actually until the beginning, nearly just before the beginning of the Second World War, the majority of the Jews were opposed to Zionism. When Tudor Herzl started his project, he was rejected by the Jews. Actually, he wanted to convene his conference in Zurich, but it was the Jews of Zurich who expelled him, refused to provide him with platform, and forced him to go to Basel, a much smaller town with a much smaller Jewish community. At the time when his conference was convened in Basel, the elders of the Jewish community in North America met in Montreal in Canada to denounce him as a heretic. So you can see, but things started changing in the Second World War when Hitler came to power. Hitler was the one who actually gave Zionism the greatest boost, because with the Holocaust, he proved to the overwhelming majority of European Jews that Europe was no longer safe for them. Those who were resisting Zionist pressure to migrate to Palestine were ready now to migrate to Palestine because of the persecution they suffered at the hands of the Nazis. Now, interestingly, Israel Shahak, who is an Israeli historian, mentions in his book that until 1939, there were communications in Europe between the leaders of the Nazis and the leaders of the Zionists, because both had a common interest. Both wanted the Jews out of Europe the Zionists in order to populate Palestine, and the Nazis because they hated the Jews and didn't want them in Europe. So the Second World War and the Holocaust was a watershed in the history of Zionism. And I think probably the zenith was reached with what is known as the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel single-handedly defeated 6 Arab armies. But then afterwards, and especially after Yom Kippur or the October 1973 war, I think slowly, Jews around the world started rethinking. And the 7th of October gave this a major boost, to the extent that a good number of students in American campuses, as well as in campuses in Europe and elsewhere in the world, protesting against Zionist brutality in Gaza, were actually Jewish. So yes, of course, I do recognize that. And that's why I always stress upon my audiences and my readers that don't ever consider this to be a Muslim religious conflict. This is not even a religious conflict. And therefore, just like one day Jews and Muslims and Christians lived and coexisted peacefully, that can happen again in the future. It is Zionism we have a problem with, and not Judaism.
Absolutely. And, you know, books on Zionism, good books on Zionism are really out there. I've been listening to and reading Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro's podcast and his book, The Empty Wagon. He incredibly and so eloquently defines Zionism as opposed to Judaism. And, you know, Judaism as a start, I agree with you, you know, in the 20s and 30s, there's this figure in the Jewish community back then. His name is Edwin Montague. He wrote to Balfour when he learned about the promise that is about to be issued. He actually called Zionism as a mischievous creed, and it will prove to be a rallying ground for anti-Semitism as well. And we see that happening in front of us. And, you know, Zionism was not viable, and Israel itself was not viable until like you mentioned, 1967, 40s and 50s. I think Israel was struggling to get Jewish population to migrate, and hence Avi Shlaim's book, you know, all these bombings and explosions and bombs implanted in synagogues by the Zionists in Iraq and other areas to kind of push the Jewish populations to migrate out of fear and intimidation. So there's a lot to be said about Zionism, which is a huge area that I really encourage everyone to go and dig deeper into what it means and what the origins are. I don't think we have enough time, but we'll sneak in 1 or 2 questions before we end. I do want to ask this question about the possible resolution for Palestinians. There's a one-state solution, there's a two-state solution. What is it that we're after as Palestinians? Do we want to go back to the 1967's borders? Are we after a one-state solution? What is the potential resolution for Palestinians?
You see, our problem in Palestine was never the lack of statehood. Palestine was never a state in its history. It was always part of a much bigger power. But its people lived there peacefully, minding their own business. I mean, my ancestors, we go all the way back to Tamim ad-Dari, who was a Christian before he embraced Islam. Palestine was ruled by the ancient Egyptians at times, by the Persians at times, by the Romans, the Byzantines, and then the Muslims came. So it's not a question of the so-called Palestinian people having a state. This is not the issue. The issue is to end this occupation, this invasion, which came from abroad. to solve somebody else's problem at the expense of the indigenous population. Something similar to what happened in Australia, New Zealand, and the Americas, very similar to it. Therefore, any talk about one state or two states is useless. Why are we talking about this? Let's talk about human freedom and human dignity. And when we are free, let us work together and decide what sort of system we want to have and what sort of power we want to be part of. If you ask me personally, I would love to see the United States of the Middle East. I would like to see Palestine part of the Ummah again. But before that, we need to be free from this racist regime that is imposing itself upon us. So again, I remind here of what Nelson Mandela said to the politicians who went to consult him in his Robben Island prison cell. He said, end apartheid and then we'll talk. And I say, end Zionism and then we will talk. Any indulgence in talking about a form of state is a distraction, and I'm not willing to be part of it.
Mr. G here says he will definitely move into the United States of the Arab world or the Middle East. It'll be a great place to be. Last question, Dr. Azzam. So how do you see the Palestinian leadership shaping in the future? The question is, does the current type of leadership in Palestine need to change or have a shift in attitude in order to ensure the efforts to rebuild occur smoothly?
Well, like every other people in the world, what we hope is to have a leadership that respects its people, that is chosen by its people, and that is accountable to its people. That's really what we want, because we've suffered, all the Arabs, not just the Palestinians, we've suffered constantly because of despotism. We need to avoid another despotic situation, another despotic state. And I think the overwhelming majority of the people in Palestine, as well as in the region, are aware of this. And that's why we had the Arab Spring in 2011. And we are likely to have another round very soon, because the peoples of Egypt, the peoples of Tunisia, the peoples of Yemen, the peoples of Libya, the peoples of Iraq, like the peoples of Syria, are all thirsty for justice. And that justice can only be provided when the people are able to choose their leaders and make those leaders accountable to them. And this is what we want in Palestine.
Absolutely. Finally, Dr. Azzam, any final remarks or recommendations for Palestinians in the diaspora, for the pro-Palestine community that have been galvanizing over the past 15 months? Do you have any message for us moving forward?
Well, I would advise everybody to have hope. Never lose hope. And the people of Gaza have taught us. We have learned a lot from their steadfastness, from their resilience, and from their hope for a better future. And at the same time, if you want to be part of this glorious future, search for your place in it. What is it that you can do and you must do?
On these notes, I really want to thank you very much, Dr. Azzam Tamimi, for joining me today. Before I end, I want to let everyone know that the video recording of this webinar will be sent out to everyone who attended and registered for this webinar. And also stay tuned for upcoming future conversations that are lining up at the end of this month and next month. I also want to extend my thanks and deep gratitude to those people who donated. This webinar was free to attend, but people generously donated, and own donations will go to families in northern Gaza. I am in touch with a family that looks after displaced people in North Gaza and orphans, providing them with whatever they can. So I want to thank you for all who donated generously. And thanks everyone for joining us today. And hopefully we'll see you again. Thanks, Dr. Azzam.
حياكم الله في أمان الله.